is a moment at every wedding, a single suspended moment where everything feels possible. The flowers are perfect, the music is soft, the candles are lit just right, and the people you love are dressed in their finest, gathered in one room, ready to witness something they believe in. It is the kind of moment that makes even cynical people go quiet. Even people who have been hurt before. Even people who stopped believing in this kind of thing years ago. That moment exists at every wedding. And it existed at this one too. For exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds by one guest's account, this wedding was beautiful. And then the door opened, and a woman walked in, and she was not alone. She did not rush. She did not scan the room for him. She did not check her dress or touch her hair or do any of the small nervous things people do when they are unsure of their welcome. She walked the way people walk when they have already decided how the evening is going to go. Composed, deliberate. The kind of calm that is not the absence of feeling, it is the presence of preparation. Behind her came 6 people. They moved the way her energy moved, measured, unhurried, impeccably dressed, not to compete, not to perform, simply to be there. And the room, without anyone saying a word, understood that something had shifted. Glasses were set down. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. And the man standing at the far end of that room felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt like he had made a mistake. His name was Marcus Hale, and he had sent her that invitation himself. Marcus sent that invitation to break her. He had rehearsed the look on her face 100 times in the mirror of his own imagination. He had pictured her arriving alone, maybe a little thinner than she used to be, wearing something that tried too hard. He had pictured her scanning the room and finding him, happy, successful, beginning again. And he had pictured her face doing that thing faces do when the person you lost has moved on better than you have. He had lived inside that fantasy for months. He had polished it. He had returned to it on bad nights the way some people return to old photographs. What he had never rehearsed, not once, not even in the darkest corner of his imagination, was this. This is the story of a man who believed humiliation was a weapon, and he was right. It is. He just spent 2 years loading it, aiming it carefully, and then pointing it directly at himself. What you are about to hear is one of the most quietly devastating true stories of pride, miscalculation, and the particular kind of destruction that only becomes visible once the dust settles. This is not a story about villains. It is not a courtroom drama or a crime. There are no bodies, no headlines, no police tape. What there is, and what makes this story so much harder to shake than any of those, is the slow, almost unbearable recognition of what happens when a man mistakes his ex-wife's silence for weakness, when he reads her stillness as defeat, when he looks at everything she built in the years after he left and decides, somehow, that none of it counts, that she is still the woman he walked away from, that she is still standing in the same place. She was not standing in the same place. She had not been standing still at all. Before we go any further, and I promise you, we are going to go very far into this story. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are not subscribed yet, hit that button right now, because the stories we bring to this channel are not the kind you want to miss. Now, let us go back to the beginning, not the wedding. The wedding is where this story ends, or rather where it reveals itself. The beginning is quieter than that. The beginning looks like a lot of beginnings look ordinary. A man and a woman, young and ambitious and full of something they would not have been able to name at the time. A small apartment in a city that felt too big for what they had. A shared dream that felt too large for the apartment. Marcus Hale and Diane Pearson met the way people meet before they know who they are going to become, which is to say imperfectly, without ceremony, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday that neither of them would remember the details of, but both of them would carry forever. Marcus was 26 years old. He had a pickup truck, a contact list that fit on one page, and an idea about logistics that everyone around him thought was either brilliant or delusional, depending on how charitable they were feeling that day. Diane was 24. She had a degree in accounting, a calm that people often mistook for passivity, and a mind that was quietly, methodically extraordinary. She did not announce herself. She never had. She was the kind of person who solved the problem before other people had finished describing it, and then waited politely for them to catch up. Marcus saw that in her almost immediately. It was in those early years one of the things he loved most about her. Later, much later, it would become one of the things that threatened him most. But that is getting ahead of the story. They married in the fall. Not a large wedding, nothing like the one we opened on, a church with 60 people in it, a reception in the back room of a restaurant that a friend of Marcus's family owned, a first dance to a song that Diane had picked because Marcus could not make up his mind. She was good at that. Stepping in when he stalled, filling the gap without making him feel the gap. That was a skill she had developed early and would spend the next 2 decades applying in ways that went almost entirely unacknowledged. Not because Marcus was cruel, not in the beginning, but because he was the kind of man who accepted competence as his due without always stopping to recognize the person providing it. The business grew, slowly at first, then all at once, the way real growth tends to happen, not in a straight line but in a lurching, uneven surge that leaves you breathless and slightly disoriented by how far you have come. Marcus's logistics company, which he had named Hale Transit, moved from regional contracts to statewide ones. He hired staff, he bought a second truck, then a fleet. He moved them out of the apartment and into a house in a neighborhood that made his mother cry with pride when she first saw it. By the time their son, Daniel, was born, Marcus Hale was no longer a man with a pickup truck and a dream. He was a man with a company, a reputation, and a growing sense of himself as someone important. Diane was still there, doing the books, raising the son, managing the household, running the invisible infrastructure of a life that Marcus increasingly wore in public as his own achievement. She did not complain. That is not entirely true. She raised concerns, she had conversations, she asked for things in that quiet, precise way she had. But she did not make scenes. She did not issue ultimatums. She was not built for that kind of confrontation, and Marcus, whether consciously or not, had come to rely on it. He knew somewhere beneath the surface of himself, in the place where we keep the knowledge we prefer not to examine, that Diane would hold the line, that she would manage, that her steadiness was structural, not conditional. He was wrong about that too, but it would take him years to find out. The woman who arrived at his second wedding, calm and impeccably dressed and flanked by 6 people who moved like a coordinated unit, that woman had been building toward that moment for 2 years, not out of bitterness, not out of spite, out of the simple, unassailable desire to become, finally and completely herself. And the tragedy of Marcus Hale, the real tragedy, the one that cuts deeper than any courtroom scene or public embarrassment, is that he was the one who set her free to do it. He filed the papers, he opened the door, and she walked through it into a version of her life he had never imagined for her, because he had never imagined, truly, what she was capable of. We are going to walk through every piece of this story, the marriage, the fractures, the divorce, and what caused it. The 2 years between the divorce and the wedding, what Marcus was doing, and more importantly, what Diane was doing. The invitation, and why he sent it, and what he expected to happen. And then that door opening, those 6 people, that silence in the room. We are going to stay with this story all the way through to the end, because the end, the real end, not the wedding day moment, but what came after, is the part that will stay with you. It is the part that has something true and useful to say about pride, and about the particular blindness of people who have been powerful for so long that they forget power is not the same as invincibility. Marcus Hale thought he knew exactly how that evening was going to go. He had been wrong about Diane before. He had never been this wrong. And by the time he understood the full extent of it, the evening was over, the guests were gone, and the story had already begun to write itself, without him and without his permission. Exactly the way Diane would have planned it, if she had planned it at all. That is one of the questions we are going to sit with together. Because the most unsettling possibility in this entire story is not that Diane orchestrated everything deliberately. The most unsettling possibility is that she did not have to. The first signs that something was changing in the Hale household did not arrive loudly. They never do. They arrived the way most damage arrives in a long marriage, quietly, incrementally, dressed up as something reasonable. A dinner Marcus forgot to mention until the morning of. A weekend trip for work that stretched into the following Monday. A habit of checking his phone at the table that began as occasional and became constant and was never once acknowledged as a change because acknowledging it would have required Marcus to look at what the change meant. Diane noticed. Diane always noticed. She had the kind of attention that missed very little, which is both a gift and a particular kind of suffering when you are married to someone who is, slowly without ever quite admitting it to themselves, beginning to look elsewhere, not just at another person, at another version of himself. The company had reached a level of success that changed the rooms Marcus was invited into. That is the most precise way to say it. The rooms changed. And with the rooms came new people, investors, contractors, local politicians who needed logistics partners for city contracts, men in expensive shoes who laughed at the right moments and remembered your name and made you feel, simply by including you, that you had arrived somewhere significant. Marcus loved those rooms. He had spent his whole life moving toward them without knowing exactly what they looked like. Now that he was in them, he discovered something uncomfortable. Diane did not fit. Or rather, and this is the more honest version, Marcus had begun to need her not to fit. Because if she fit, then she belonged there too, and if she belonged there too, then the room was not his achievement. It was theirs, and he needed it to be his. This is not an unusual story. That is one of the things that makes it so hard to hear. Men who build something real and then quietly push aside the person who helped them build it, this happens with a frequency that should be shocking and somehow never quite is. Marcus did not think of himself as that man. He would have rejected the description with genuine offense. In his own account of his marriage, he was someone who had tried, who had worked hard, who had provided well, and who had simply grown in a direction that his wife had not grown in. That was the story he told. At dinner parties, to his attorney, to himself in the car on long drives, he had grown, she had stayed, the distance between them was a matter of trajectory, not cruelty. He believed this. That is important to understand. He was not lying. He was doing something more dangerous than lying. He was editing. What Marcus edited out of his account of the marriage was the period, roughly 18 months, centered around the 3rd year after Hale Transit went fully regional, when Diane had tried to grow alongside him. She had made connections of her own. She had, through a business networking group she had joined quietly and without fanfare, developed a relationship with a woman named Carol Ossie. Carol ran a boutique investment firm that focused on minority-owned businesses and emerging supply chain companies. She was sharp, well-connected, and she had seen in Diane exactly what anyone with clear eyes saw. A woman of significant capability who was operating well below her ceiling. Carol had suggested they explore something together. A small investment vehicle. Low exposure, high potential, the kind of opportunity that required patience more than capital. Diane had brought it to Marcus. He had discouraged it, not cruelly. He had simply said he did not think the timing was right, that they had enough on their plate, that he would look at the numbers when things settled down. Things never settled down. The conversation was never revisited. And Diane, who had learned across 15 years of marriage how to read the silences between Marcus's words, understood that the door had been closed. She did not push it open. Not then. What she did instead was something Marcus would never have predicted, because it did not look like anything. She stayed, she managed, she continued doing the invisible work that held their life together while Marcus expanded into the new rooms and the new version of himself. But she also waited, not with resentment, or not only with resentment, with the particular patience of someone who knows that their moment has not arrived yet but believes, with a quiet and unshakable certainty, that it will. Diane Hale was not a woman who had given up. She was a woman who was waiting for the right conditions. And the conditions, when they finally arrived, would come from the last place she expected. They would come from Marcus himself. The divorce was filed on a Thursday in early March. Marcus' attorney sent the paperwork. Diane's attorney, a woman she had retained 6 months earlier, quietly, without telling Marcus, which tells you something about what she already knew, reviewed it within 48 hours and sent back a response that was, by all accounts, precise and thorough and entirely without drama. Marcus had expected the process to be difficult. He had steeled himself for it. He had prepared emotionally for tears, for accusations, for the kind of prolonged negotiation that divorces become when one party is devastated and the other is resolved. What he got instead was efficiency. Diane moved through the divorce the way she moved through everything. Without wasted motion, without performance, with a clarity that, had Marcus been paying a different kind of attention, would have told him everything he needed to know about who she was and what she was capable of. The settlement was fair. Marcus had been generous in the terms, genuinely so, and this is one of the details that complicates the portrait of him, because Marcus Hale was not a simple man, and this story does not benefit from making him one. He ensured Diane was financially stable. The house went to her. The settlement included a figure that, while not extravagant, was enough to give her genuine options. He told himself, and he may have partly believed it, that this generosity absolved something. It did not. Generosity in the terms of a divorce does not undo the terms of a marriage. It does not refund the years. It does not restore the opportunities deferred or the connections discouraged or the quiet erosions of a person's sense of their own possibilities. Diane took the settlement, thanked her attorney, and on the day the divorce was finalized, she made 2 phone calls. The first was to her son Daniel. The second was to Carol Osei. Carol had not forgotten Diane. That is the first thing to understand about what came next. Carol Osei was a woman who kept mental files on people she believed in. And Diane Pearson, she had gone back to Pearson after the divorce, quietly, without announcement, had been in Carol's mental file for years. When Diane called, Carol picked up on the second ring. They met for lunch the following week. And by the end of that lunch, the thing that Marcus had discouraged 3 years earlier was back on the table. Except now the conditions were different. Now Diane had time, capital, and something she had not fully had inside the marriage: the freedom to move. Carol brought in 2 colleagues, both seasoned, both connected in the regional supply chain space that Diane understood deeply from her years, managing the books at Hale Transit. The 4 of them formed a quiet investment group. No press, no announcements. Just 4 people who knew what they were doing, moving carefully in a market they understood, building something that would take 2 years to fully materialize, but that was, from the very first meeting, unmistakably real. Marcus, during those same 2 years, was living loudly. This is not a criticism, it is simply the accurate description of how he moved through that period. He sold a portion of Hale Transit to a private equity group, which gave him liquidity and a profile boost and the kind of local business press coverage that he had always wanted and had never quite allowed himself to admit he wanted. He was photographed at events. He joined a board. He met Veronica at a charity function in October of the first year after the divorce. She was 38, the daughter of a well-connected commercial real estate developer, polished and warm and genuinely kind in ways that Marcus did not always recognize because he was too busy being impressed by her family's name. They moved quickly. By spring, they were serious. By summer, they were engaged. The engagement announcement went everywhere Marcus could put it. Veronica was not a villain in this story. That needs to be said clearly and early, because it is easy, in stories like this one, to flatten the people around the central conflict into supporting roles that serve the drama. Veronica Marsh was a real person with her own history and her own instincts and her own private reservations that she was not, in the early stages of their relationship, fully willing to examine. She had concerns about Marcus that she filed away as nerves. She noticed things about how he spoke about his ex-wife, the particular edge in his voice, the way his jaw tightened when her name came up, The fact that he brought Diane up more often than a man who had moved on had any reason to. She noticed, and she did not act on what she noticed, which is its own kind of story, but not the one we are telling today. What we are telling today is the story of an invitation. And the invitation began as so many acts of calculated unkindness begin with a piece of information that landed badly. Marcus heard, through a mutual contact at a business function, that Diane was doing well, more than well. The contact, a man named Gerald, who had known both of them during the marriage and had maintained an uneasy friendship with both after it, mentioned it casually. He said Diane had been seen at a regional investment conference, that she had been introduced as a principal in some kind of fund, that she looked, in Gerald's words, incredible. Marcus smiled and said that was great to hear and changed the subject. And then he drove home and sat in his car in the driveway for 22 minutes without going inside. Because something about that information had landed in a place he could not immediately identify, and it sat there, unprocessed, for weeks. He did not understand at first what was bothering him. He told himself it was nothing. He had moved on. He was engaged to a woman he cared about. He was building the next chapter of his life with energy and intention. He was fine. He kept saying that to himself with a frequency that should have been its own warning sign. He was fine. He was fine. He was fine. And then one evening, about 3 weeks after Gerald's comment, he was sitting at his desk, reviewing the guest list for the wedding, a task he had, largely left to Veronica and her mother, but had decided that evening to look over himself, and he stopped at the section for mutual acquaintances. People who had known both him and Diane. People who would be sitting in that room and who had been present for both versions of his life, the before and the after. And something moved in him, something that was not mature or generous or forward-looking, something old and competitive and wounded. And before he had fully thought it through, before the better part of him had a chance to weigh in, he had written her name on the list. Diane Pearson, plus guest. He stared at it for a long time, then he changed it, +6. He did not know why he wrote 6. He would later say he had no idea where that number came from, but he wrote it, and he left it, and the next morning he told himself he would remove it, and he did not remove it. And the invitation went out with the others, on cream cardstock with gold lettering, in an envelope that smelled faintly of something expensive. He wrote the note inside himself. No hard feelings. Hope you can celebrate with us. He sealed it before he could reconsider. He told Veronica he had invited Diane because it was the mature thing to do. Veronica said very little. She had learned by then which silences were safe to keep. Before we go any further into what happened next, and what happened next is the part of this story that people who heard it firsthand still talk about years later, we want to pause for just a moment. If you have made it this far into this story, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel exists for. So let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We read every single one. And if you are not already subscribed, do it now, because what is coming in the next part of this story is the reason we started telling it in the first place. Diane received the invitation on a Wednesday. She was at her kitchen table when it arrived. She had kept the house, and she had done things to it in the 2 years since Marcus left that made it feel finally entirely like hers. New paint, different furniture. The kind of small, deliberate changes that are less about decoration and more about reclamation. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she opened it. She opened it anyway. She read the card. She read the note. She set both down on the table and looked out the window for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Carol. The call lasted 11 minutes. When it ended, Diane went back to the table, picked up the response card, and wrote, "Attending. Party of 7. She thought about it. Crossed out 7, wrote 6, sealed it, put it in the mailbox herself. Carol Ossie had, over the course of their 2-year partnership, become something more than a business associate to Diane. She had become the kind of friend that arrives late in life and immediately makes you wonder how you manage without her. Practical, direct, fiercely intelligent, and possessed of a sense of humor so dry it sometimes took Diane a full beat to realize she was being made to laugh. When Diane called her about the invitation, Carol listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then she said, with the particular calm of someone who has already done the math, "We should go, not because of him." Diane understood what she meant. Not to make a point or land a blow or stage a confrontation, simply because going composed, prepared, and surrounded by people who knew exactly who Diane was, would say everything that needed to be said without a single word being spoken. This is the kind of strategy that only works if you're genuinely not afraid. Diane was not afraid. She had not been afraid for a long time. She had just been waiting for the occasion to demonstrate it. The 6 people Diane brought with her to that wedding were not chosen randomly. Each of them represented something specific, a chapter of the life she had built in the 2 years since Marcus left. There was Carol herself, whose presence alone communicated volumes to anyone who knew the regional business landscape. There was Raymond Ossie, Carol's brother, who moved in financial circles that overlapped in ways Marcus had never bothered to trace. There was Diane's attorney, a woman named Patricia Wynn, who had handled the divorce with such precision that Marcus's own attorney had commented on it afterward. There was a man named Thomas Garrett, a former colleague of Marcus's from the early Hale Transit years, who had, after a falling out with Marcus over a contract dispute, quietly realigned himself in Diane's direction, not out of disloyalty but out of the simple recognition that Diane was the more trustworthy of the two. There was a woman named Sandra Lee, one of the other principals in Diane's investment group, whose presence at any table tended to raise the perceived value of that table. And then there was Daniel, Diane's son, 24 years old, broad-shouldered, quiet in the way his mother was quiet, with intention rather than uncertainty. He had not wanted to come. Diane had not asked him to come. He had called her 3 days before the wedding and said he was coming. She had said very little. She had understood everything. The morning of the wedding, Marcus woke up with the particular anxious energy of a man who has done something he cannot undo and is only now beginning to feel the full shape of it. He told himself it was wedding day nerves. He was good at renaming things. He dressed carefully. He was sharp in his suit. Marcus Hale had always known how to wear a suit, had always understood the language of appearance. And on this morning, he deployed that understanding with extra precision. Veronica was in a separate suite per tradition, and they had not spoken since the previous evening's rehearsal dinner, which had gone smoothly and warmly and without incident. Marcus checked his phone. No messages from Diane. He did not know what he had been expecting. He put his phone in his pocket and went downstairs. The venue was a converted estate on the edge of the city, the kind of place that existed specifically to make ordinary moments feel historic. High ceilings, original hardwood, tall windows that let in a particular quality of light in the late morning that made everyone inside look like they belonged in a painting. The florist had done extraordinary work. The tables were set with the kind of care that made guests feel, the moment they walked in, that someone had thought carefully about their comfort. Marcus walked through the space before the guests arrived and felt, genuinely, a swell of something close to happiness. He had built this. He had gotten here. Whatever else was complicated in his life, this moment was real, and it was his, and he allowed himself to feel it fully for approximately 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Then the venue coordinator touched his arm and told him quietly that Diane's party had arrived. They were early. They were in the parking lot. He did not go to the window. He thought about it. He did not go. He straightened his jacket and told himself it was fine and went to find his best man, a childhood friend named Kevin, who had known Marcus long enough to read every register of his face and who, when Marcus found him, looked at him with an expression that said, "I told you this was a bad idea." Marcus did not acknowledge the expression. He clapped Kevin on the shoulder and said something about needing a drink, and Kevin laughed, and they went to the bar, and for the next 40 minutes, Marcus performed confidence with the precision of a man who had been performing it his whole life and was very, very good at it. Diane entered the reception hall at 11:53 in the morning. The ceremony was not scheduled until 1 o'clock, which meant the room was still in cocktail hour configuration, people moving, glasses in hand, the low hum of conversation and early afternoon light. She did not make an entrance. That is the precise and important thing to understand about how she moved through that door. She simply arrived. She was wearing a deep burgundy dress, not bridal, not competitive, simply right, and her hair was pulled back with a kind of effortless precision that takes significant effort. Her group moved with her in a loose formation that was not rehearsed but felt coordinated, the way things feel coordinated when the people involved simply know who they are and what they are doing there. They found their table. They sat. Diane greeted 2 guests nearby with the warmth of someone who had genuinely missed them. She accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server. She did not look for Marcus. She did not need to. She knew exactly where he was. Marcus saw her from across the room. He was mid-conversation with one of his investors when she walked in, and he managed barely, by the particular discipline of a man who has spent decades managing his exterior, to hold the conversation for another 30 seconds before excusing himself. He moved to Kevin's side. Kevin said nothing. Marcus said nothing. They both looked at the table where Diane was now seated, and at the 6 people around her, and at the way the room had subtly redistributed its attention in that direction, without anyone seeming to mean to. Marcus recognized Carol Osei. He recognized Patricia Wynn. He recognized Thomas Garrett. That one landed differently. The recognition of someone he had considered his, who had quietly become hers. He did not immediately recognize Raymond Osei. He would later. He did not recognize Sandra Lee. He would learn her name later, too, in a context he had not anticipated. And then he saw Daniel, his son, seated at the far end of the table with the particular stillness of a young man who has decided exactly how much of himself he is willing to give to this room. Marcus looked at his son for a long moment. Daniel did not look back. The cocktail hour moved. Conversations happened. The room did what rooms do at weddings. It generated warmth and noise in the particular social choreography of people trying to seem at ease in formal clothes. Marcus circulated. He was good at this, had always been good at this. And for stretches of 20 and 30 minutes, he lost himself in it and almost forgot what was happening at the table in the far corner, almost. And then he would catch a fragment, Diane's laugh, low and unhurried, at something Carol had said, or Raymond Osei's voice, carrying slightly above the ambient noise, saying something to a man Marcus suddenly realized was Veronica's father. He stopped. He watched. Raymond and Veronica's father, whose name was William Marsh, a man Marcus had been carefully, strategically building a relationship with for the better part of a year, were talking with the ease of people who already know each other well. Marcus did not understand what he was seeing yet. He filed it, he moved on, he told himself it was nothing. He was getting very good at telling himself things were nothing. 15 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, the guests began moving from the reception hall toward the ceremony room. The shift was gradual, guided by the venue staff with the practiced subtlety of people who do this every weekend. Marcus was directed to a holding room where he would wait with Kevin until his cue. He straightened his jacket again. Kevin handed him a glass of water. They waited. The minutes moved. At 12:53, 7 minutes before the 1 o'clock start, the venue coordinator knocked on the door. She looked at Marcus with an expression that was professionally neutral in a way that communicated very clearly that things were not neutral. She said that Veronica had asked for a few extra minutes. She said she was sure everything was fine. She left. Marcus stood very still. The extra few minutes became 10. Then 15. Kevin said something meant to be reassuring. Marcus did not hear it. At 1:11, there was a knock on the door. Not the coordinator this time. It was Veronica's mother. Her expression was the expression of a woman who had prepared for this moment with the specific kind of composure that takes years of difficult experience to develop. She said that Veronica needed to speak with Marcus, that she was in the small sitting room off the east corridor, that she was sorry for the delay. She held the door open. Marcus followed her through it. Kevin started to follow. Veronica's mother said gently that it was probably best if Kevin waited. Kevin stopped. The door closed. Marcus found Veronica standing at the window of the sitting room, still in her dress, which was extraordinary, the kind of dress that exists to mark an occasion, cream and structured and carefully made. She was holding her bouquet. She did not turn around immediately when he entered. When she did turn around, her face was composed in a way that Marcus had seen before on exactly one other person in exactly this kind of moment. The composure of someone who has already done the hardest part inside themselves and is now simply delivering the conclusion. She said 3 sentences. We are not going to dramatize them or speculate on their exact wording, because the exact wording is not the point. The point is what they amounted to, which was this. She was not ready. She had not been ready, she was realizing, for longer than today. And she was sorry, genuinely, clearly sorry, but she could not go through with it. Not today. Not like this. Marcus stood in that sitting room for a long time after she left. The bouquet she had been carrying was on the chair by the window, where she had set it down. The ceremony room, 30 feet away, was full of people who had no idea what had just happened. Kevin was somewhere in the building, waiting. Diane was somewhere in the building, waiting. The whole machinery of the day was paused, suspended, waiting for something to happen next. Marcus looked at the bouquet. He looked at the window. He thought, for reasons he would never fully explain, about the drive he used to make in the early years of Hail Transit. Just him and the pickup truck and a delivery schedule and the absolute, uncomplicated certainty that if he just kept moving, things would get better. He had kept moving. Things had gotten better, and then different, and then better again by some measures and worse by others. He had kept moving, and he had gotten here, to this sitting room, to this bouquet, to this. The ceremony was postponed. The official explanation given to guests, delivered by the venue coordinator with the diplomatic precision of someone who has handled worse, was a scheduling issue, a small, manageable delay. The guests were directed back to the reception hall and offered additional refreshments. Some of them went. Some of them lingered in the corridor and spoke in low voices. 2 of them, who had been at Marcus and Diane's first wedding 23 years earlier, looked at each other across the room with an expression that needed no translation. At Diane's table, very little changed. Carol said something. Diane responded. Raymond poured more water. Daniel remained still. Nobody at that table performed surprise, which is its own kind of statement. What happened in the weeks after the wedding is, in some ways, the most important part of this story. Because what happened was not what Marcus expected. He had braced himself for exposure, for the story to become ugly and public and pointed. For Diane or someone in her group to speak to the press, to post something, to capitalize on the moment with the kind of move he would have made in their position. None of that happened. Diane said nothing publicly. Carol said nothing. Raymond said nothing. Patricia Wynn, the attorney, said nothing. Thomas Garrett, who had once been Marcus's, said nothing. Sandra Lee, whose name Marcus had now researched thoroughly, said nothing. Daniel, who had every reason to say something, said nothing. The silence from that direction was total. Marcus would privately admit this only to Kevin. Months later, more devastating than any public statement could have been. The story got out anyway. It always does. It spread through the network of wedding guests and their extended connections with the particular speed of stories that are too strange and too perfectly shaped not to share. By the following week, it had moved beyond the immediate social circle into the broader business community. The version that circulated was not vicious. It did not need to be. The facts stated plainly: man invites ex-wife to second wedding. Ex-wife arrives composed and well-attended. Wedding is called off. Were sufficient on their own. The interpretation people layered onto those facts was consistent and unkind in the specific way that public narratives are unkind when the person at the center of them has, at some prior point, given the impression of being invulnerable. Marcus had given that impression for years. The reckoning, when it arrived, had the quality of inevitability. His business did not collapse. That would be too neat, too punitive, too much like a story designed to deliver a lesson rather than reflect reality. Hale Transit continued to operate. Marcus continued to run it. But the texture of his professional relationships changed in ways that were difficult to quantify and impossible to ignore. Certain calls took longer to be returned. Certain rooms felt subtly different when he entered them. Nothing dramatic. Nothing he could point to and name. Just the cumulative weight of a reputation that had shifted, slightly but permanently, in a direction he had not chosen and could not reverse. William Marsh, Veronica's father, reduced his engagement with Marcus significantly over the following months. Whether this was related to Raymond Ossie's conversation at the wedding, or to Veronica's decision, or simply to the natural cooling of a relationship that had been built on the foundation of a marriage that did not happen, Marcus was never entirely certain. The uncertainty was its own punishment. Veronica and Marcus did not reconcile. She moved back to her own apartment, resumed her own life, and in the careful, dignified way that she had handled most things, declined to discuss publicly what had happened or why. She and Marcus spoke twice in the month after the wedding, both times by phone, both times briefly. She was not hostile, she was not warm. She was the version of herself that exists after a decision has been made, and all that remains is the logistics of moving forward. Marcus respected it. He did not entirely understand it, but he respected it. He had a long history of not entirely understanding the women in his life, and a shorter history of recognizing that pattern, and an even shorter history of doing anything about it. Diane's investment group closed its acquisition 8 months after the wedding. The return on the supply chain stake exceeded projections by a margin that Carol later described, in the understated way of someone who does not need to dramatize her own success, as satisfying. Diane took her portion and invested it forward into 2 new positions that her group had been tracking. She did not celebrate publicly. She continued to live in the house. She continued to not post about Marcus, not comment on the wedding story as it circulated, not engage with the version of events that people were telling. She was asked once by a mutual acquaintance who ran into her at a restaurant whether she had planned any of it, whether she had known going in what would happen. Diane looked at the woman for a moment. Then she said something that the woman would repeat for years, not because it was clever or cutting, but because it was so simple and so completely true. She said, "I just went to a wedding." Daniel Hale, who had sat at that table in silence and then driven his mother home afterward and stayed for dinner and helped her wash the dishes and left at 9:30 without saying much about any of it. Daniel told a friend, months later, something that eventually made its way back to the people who were still following this story. He said that on the drive home from the wedding, his mother had been quiet for a long time, and then she had said, looking out the passenger window, "Your father used to be afraid that I would outgrow him. I always thought that was silly. I never wanted to outgrow him. I just wanted to grow." That was the whole thing. That was always the whole thing. Daniel said he had not known what to say, so he had just driven. And his mother had looked out the window, and after a while she had started talking about something else entirely. There is a version of this story where Marcus Hale is the villain, where every choice he made is read as evidence of a character that was always going to arrive at this destination. That version is easier to tell and easier to hear because it locates the problem in one person and leaves everyone else clean. But that version is not this version. Marcus was not a villain. He was something more common and in some ways more troubling. A man of genuine capability and genuine limitation, who confused the two for long enough that the confusion became structural. He loved Diane in the way that people love things they have stopped seeing clearly, as a fixture rather than a person, as a context rather than a life. He lost her the same way, gradually then all at once, and by the time he understood the magnitude of what he had lost, he had already spent 2 years building a narrative in which losing her was the story of his freedom. It takes a particular kind of courage to look at that narrative and revise it. Marcus may yet develop that courage. We do not know. The story does not offer us that resolution. Stories rarely do. What the story does offer, what it has always offered, for anyone willing to sit with it, is a question. Not about justice, because justice in the neat sense did not fully arrive here. Not about karma, because the universe is rarely that precise. The question is simpler and more uncomfortable than either of those. It is this: what do we miss when we stop seeing the people closest to us? What do we cost ourselves, not just them, but ourselves, when we read someone's stillness as an absence of motion, when we interpret someone's patience as an absence of direction? Diane Pearson did not become extraordinary after Marcus left. She was extraordinary the whole time. The difference is that after Marcus left, there was no one in the room to mismeasure her. And without anyone to mismeasure her, she simply became at last the full size of herself. Marcus sent that invitation to break her. He had rehearsed the look on her face 100 times. What he had never rehearsed was a woman who had nothing left to prove, arriving on time, sitting down, and simply being who she was. It turned out that was enough. It turned out that was everything. That is the story of the man who invited his ex-wife to his wedding to humiliate her, and of the woman who came with her entourage, and of the 6 people she brought who did not need to say a single word, and of the bouquet left on a chair in a sitting room, and of a son who drove his mother home and washed the dishes and said nothing much about and of a room full of people who set their glasses down and went quiet and understood, in the instinctive way that people understand things before they can articulate them, that they were witnessing something. They just could not have told you in the moment exactly what it was. Now you know. If this story moved you, if it made you think about someone you know, or something you have witnessed, or something in your own life that rhymes with any piece of what Marcus and Diane went through, we want to hear about it. Drop a comment. Tell us what hit you hardest. Tell us where you are watching from. This channel exists because of the people who stay until the end of the story, and you are one of them. We see you, and if you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. Because the next story we are bringing you belongs in the same breath as this one, and you do not want to come in halfway through. Stay with us. There's always another story, and the best ones always the ones nobody saw coming.